The paper we're diving into today is Язык Сфирали как инструмент преодоления двоичного восприятия, which translates as the Sfiral Language as a tool for overcoming binary perception by Oleg Basargin.
Yeah, it's quite a title, isn't it? Oleg Basargin takes on this ambitious idea. Can we get out of our usual trap of thinking in binaries, like yes and no, good and bad, and move towards something more multidimensional? So the core question the paper asks is basically, can a specific set of symbols, a new language really, help us break out of binary thought and see reality in kind of a richer way?
Right, and honestly, that's a huge question, because so much of the way we interact with, well, everything, from computers to social issues, is based on this two-sided logic, right? Like on-off, 0-1, true-false.
Exactly. So Basargin introduces this thing called the spheral, which is some sort of device, but also a metaphor, that creates these shadows or light shapes. The point is, these shapes map onto symbols we already find in ancient scripts, like Cherokee, Sumerian cuneiform, even stuff like Rongo Rongo from Easter Island. But what makes Sfiral unique is its structure. It's all about S-curves, loops, cycles, stuff that's kind of anti-binary. It's fractal, non-linear, and, well, just messy in a good way.
Yeah, it's neat. The method is kind of hands-on, too, which I wasn't expecting. Like, the paper describes literally making shadows with the Sfiral device and then comparing those forms to all these ancient letters and characters from different writing systems.
It's almost retro in its approach. It's not just about theory, he's literally analyzing the way these shadows bend, loop, and connect. Then he tracks parallels between those and symbols like Ija or Fita from Old Slavic scripts, or Shui, meaning water in ancient Chinese characters.
And so these shadow symbols represent concepts like motion, connection, and harmony, kind of flowing rather than splitting things into two. He finds that S-shaped shadows show movement or transformation, looped shapes are about connection or growth, and circular forms suggest harmony, kind of the cosmic order.
It gets really wild. He pushes it into applications too. So, not just theoretical musings, but, for example, using these ideas to design a convergent programming language, where the structure of the code reflects that non-binary interconnected thinking. He even sketches out a concept called spheral DNA, a model for thinking about genetics that's fractal and mirrored, not just string of letters A, C, T, G.
And on the level of, like, consciousness, he claims that reading or interpreting with the Sfiral symbols could expand the way we think, not just in language, but in how we perceive time, culture, or even moments of insight. He talks about kairos, which is that ancient Greek idea of the right or opportune moment, symbolized by the harmony of time.
It's definitely out there, but I appreciate the boldness. He ties it all back to Plato's cave, the allegory where, humans are chained in a cave seeing only shadows, mistaking them for reality. Basargin says our attachment to binaries is like mistaking shadows for reality. The spheral helps us step out and see the multidimensional source.
I like that he digs into challenges, too. He admits, hey, we don't know if this language can really plug into everyday communication, or how. Like, are people ready to give up either-or thinking for, I don't know, like double helix reasoning?
Or, is there enough coffee in the world for everyone to rewire their brains away from breakfast table debates? Is this good, or is this bad? Sometimes I feel like we need both the binary and the in-between, Actually, speaking of breakfast, did you ever notice how people divide themselves into coffee or tea camps, but then you meet someone who drinks both and it just throws you off?
Haha, totally. Though the Sfiral might say that person has tapped into their multidimensional beverage side. But yeah, what Basargin proposes isn't a replacement for all logic, just an expansion, a new tool, not a new dogma.
Right, which is kind of refreshing. Academic research, after all, is more about opening up the landscape of ideas than laying down the law. Papers like this, whether or not you agree with their conclusions, give us a nudge to imagine how we might see and build the world differently.
So, if listeners take anything away, maybe it's that even the act of noticing our own habits of binary thinking is powerful. And who knows, maybe a squiggly shadow on the wall, the next time you see one, could hint at a whole new way of making sense of things.
Now that's a takeaway I can get behind. Thanks for the chat.
Thanks. See you next time. The paper we're diving into today is called The Sfiral Language as a Tool for Transcending Binary Perception, A Path to Multidimensional Reality by O.S. Basargin. Quite a title, huh?
Yeah, just a casual Thursday topic, transcending binary perception and finding a new reality. No biggie. But honestly, the minute I saw Plato's allegory of the cave in the abstract, I was like, oh, this is about getting out of some serious intellectual shadows.
Exactly. And the core question Basargin tackles is, well, why are we all thinking in these really rigid either-or ways? Like good versus bad, true versus false. It's super constraining. But it's kind of how our society and technology are hardwired.
Totally. This idea that we're stuck in a kind of black or white thinking is, both really obvious and also easy to forget in daily life. Basargin's twist is that he's proposing this thing called the Sfiral language. It's a symbolic or even visual language, apparently created by casting light and shadow with this Sfiral device, and it supposedly helps us break out of the binary cage.
Right. And what I find fascinating is how the Sfiral device generates these light shadow symbols that kind of echo forms you find in ancient scripts. We're talking about things like Cherokee script, Sumerian cuneiform, even ancient Chinese jiaguwen, and more. He argues that these symbols have this multidimensionality that goes beyond yes-no logic.
So, to break that down, he isn't just like, look, a squiggle. He's actually saying these shapes, like loops and S-curves, show up in all these ancient systems. And he suggests they represent concepts that are richer than just on or off. So you've got motion, community, harmony, all woven into these symbols.
The methodology is actually pretty hands-on. He shines a light through the Sfiral device, analyzes the shapes that come out, and then compares those with ancient scripts. And it isn't just a one-to-one mapping. He really tries to dig into what those shapes have meant across cultures. It's sort of a mashup of linguistics, philosophy, even a little tech design and biology.
Yeah, the biology bit was a surprise for me. He talks about spiral DNA, which riffs on the idea of mirror antisymmetry and fractals, sort of mapping these symbolic patterns onto how genes replicate. That part felt a little speculative, if I'm honest, but also kind of mind-blowing if you don't try to nitpick the science.
Well, and then there's the technology angle. He sketches out the idea for a convergent programming language using these spiral-inspired operators. So instead of, if X is true, do Y, you'd have functions for flow, connection, and harmony. It's like redesigning the logic of computers, or maybe AI, to be less binary, more multidimensional.
Which is pretty wild because it makes you think, are we missing discovery or creativity in tech and biology just because our foundational logic is so binary? I mean, computers as we know them, classical ones at least, are all zeros and ones. But maybe that's just a convenient.
The paper we're diving into today is Эталонное описание устройства Сфираль, which translates to Reference Description of the Sfiral Device by Oleg Basargin.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I was actually pretty intrigued when I saw the title. Like, what even is a Sfiral? It sort of sounds like a combination of spiral and sphere, but, well, turns out it's something a bit more unusual.
Right? Let's start with basics. The core question Basargin is tackling here is, how do you precisely describe the structure and properties of this thing called a sfiral in mathematical terms? so that other researchers or engineers can actually use or build on it. And it's significant, I think, because he's not just describing a theoretical object. He's setting up a kind of blueprint for modeling all sorts of systems, from physics and architecture to maybe, I don't know, quantum computing one day?
Yeah, exactly. The Sfiral is this topologically stable structure. So basically, it keeps its properties even if you twist or squash it a bit, which is a big deal in physics and engineering. And what's cool is that it's made up of two mirror antisymmetric loops joined by an S-shaped connector. The whole thing can also have fractal properties, so you can have these repeating patterns at different scales.
Yeah, the fractal thing really caught my attention. This idea that you can take the basic Sfiral shape and kind of nest new versions of it inside itself at different levels. That's pretty elegant. Mathematically, he lays out all these parameters. There's r for the radius of the loop, h for the height difference between the loops, phi as the phase shift. You get these differential and parametric equations that define how each part of the structure evolves or connects.
And then there's the S of theta function, which is this formula that controls how the S-shaped piece connects the two loops. That S connector isn't just like a decoration either. It's really what gives the Sfiral its structural stability. Health it, the whole thing just doesn't work as a defined object.
Okay, so if I'm following, he's really building up this mathematical recipe for the Sfiral. And the interesting thing for listeners maybe is that once you have those equations, you've got a toolkit. You could generate one of these structures in a simulation, or maybe even try to print it with a 3D printer. Either way, you're not guessing. You're actually following a set of rules.
Yeah, his approach is systematic. Basargin splits up the description. There's a section on the differential equations for how the radius and height of the loops change, then another part on the parametric equations for drawing each loop in three-dimensional space. And he talks about what happens if you go into fractals, so what changes when you create more and more nested versions of the Sfiral inside itself. He even includes tables of key parameters at different levels of that fractal nesting.
I have to say, it's pretty visually striking if you look at the 3D models he references. The anti-symmetrical loops, the S connector, all fitting together. There's almost something biological about it, like the double helix in DNA or maybe the structure of viral capsids. Although, now that I think about it, everything in nature eventually reminds me of something else. I once spent 2 hours looking at pine cones and trying to figure out if they had the same kind of fractal nesting. Spoiler, not quite, but
Pine cones as the lost cousins of the Sfiral? Not a bad digression, actually. This idea that nature is full of these repeating, scalable patterns. That's kind of the promise here. If you can get the math down for one structure, you have a template for describing lots of other things.
That's a really good point. And Basargin emphasizes that this isn't just an abstract exercise. The math holds up whether you keep the structure simple or push it to have many levels of fractal complexity. And importantly, it's robust, so you can tweak the parameters, scale it up or down, and it won't break the logic.
Right, and he wraps up by suggesting these equations could be useful for modeling all sorts of systems: quantum computing, physical simulations, even architecture. So it's less about carving some final truth in stone and more about providing tools, something listeners could actually play with or that future researchers could rework.
Exactly. It's a conversation starter for anyone interested in geometry, design, or the structure of physical processes.
So, yeah, maybe next time you spot a swirl, a spiral, or an interesting S-curve, you'll wonder if it's secretly a Sfiral in disguise, waiting for someone to write its equations.
And maybe, if nothing else, you'll have a new appreciation for how much math there is lurking under the surface of even the simplest shapes.
Or pine cones.
Or pine cones. The paper we're diving into today is «Отчет по исследованию сферальной интерференции в квантовой системе», or Report on the Study of Spiral Interference in a Quantum System by Oleg Basargin. Quite the mouthful, right?
Yeah, and I have to say, just the phrase spiral interference in quantum systems kind of made me pause. Like, what is that? Quantum stuff is already wild, but adding spiral and fractal to the mix, it's like, are we talking about something out of science fiction here?
I know, but the core question Basargin is dealing with is surprisingly concrete. He's asking whether stable, structured interference patterns, specifically ones following a sort of spiral or fractal logic, can appear and persist in quantum systems. And actually, why is that significant? Well, if these patterns exist and aren't just random noise, that means we might be able to design quantum algorithms that tap into these patterns in a systematic way, right?
Exactly. So he's basically challenging this assumption that quantum probabilistic outcomes are always kind of messy and random by proposing that certain complex, almost fractal patterns could be built into the probability distributions. Like, you could get these hotspots or nodes where particular quantum states are super likely. The cool thing is, he calls these anomalous nodes, and if those nodes persist, regardless of how you scale the system or shake up the quantum gates, then you've really found something interesting.
Right. So, to get at this, Basargin ran a series of experiments on IBM's quantum processors, which is amazing to me. Quantum computing used to be like science fantasy, and now people are running real experiments on them. Anyway, he essentially created superpositions with 5, 7, and 9 qubits, using Hadamard gates and custom phase shifts that follow his spiral pattern idea. Then he linked qubits using C0 gates, sometimes in sequential lines, sometimes crossing them, a real test of how robust this pattern is.
He measured the probabilities of different quantum states at the end, looking for those nodes, those outcomes that just kept popping up with way higher probabilities than you'd expect from, pure randomness. And guess what? Across all 4 experiments, regardless of circuit architecture, states labeled 0 and 1 came up in a weirdly stable way, with probabilities much higher than just chance would give you.
And as the number of qubits increased, from 5 to 7 to 9, the effect actually got stronger, not weaker. That's kind of counterintuitive. You'd think adding complexity would make things blurrier, but instead, the anomalies get bolder. For instance, in one run, the state 0 had almost 70% probability. That's massive for something that, in a uniformly random setup, should be tiny.
Right, and here's a detail I found fun. Even when Basargin switched up the quantum logic, like changing which qubits were connected by C0 gates, the core anomaly stuck around. The spiral interference didn't care about the wiring. It just morphed a bit, but didn't go away. That's a strong hint we're seeing some deep underlying effect, not just a one-off fluke in quantum noise.
It makes you wonder, are there, other areas in physics or computing where fractal or spiral effects have shown up? Actually, I recall reading about spiral waves in chemical reactions, but I don't know. Maybe that's just a coincidence. Quantum stuff operates on a whole different level.
Yeah, no, it reminds me of how nature loves repeating patterns at all scales. But back to the paper. Basargin's final takeaway is pretty bold. He's saying this spiral interference could form the foundation for a whole new class of quantum algorithms, like algorithms that deliberately use these structured temporal fractals to, maybe optimize calculations or do things classical computers can't even dream of.
Of course, it's worth mentioning, this is one research report, so we shouldn't take it as gospel. Even Basargin says more work is needed, like developing specific algorithms that leverage this effect and testing them on real-world problems. But the fact that there's experimental evidence for this stable, structured interference, it's a nudge to the whole field to dig deeper.
Yeah, it makes you realize how academic research is, not about final answers, but about opening a new door. Like, this really highlights how the boundaries of what's random and what's structured in quantum systems could be way more interesting than we thought.
So if you're listening and wondering, does this matter for me? Well, maybe not this year, But if quantum computers ever leave the lab and change how we calculate or encrypt things or simulate the universe, these weird spiral patterns might be part of the blueprint.
Or maybe they'll just look cool when we visualize the math. Either way, it's another reminder. Nature has patterns even where we least expect them.
And exploring those patterns, like Basargin did, is what moves science forward, even if we fumble through some spirals along the way. The paper we're diving into today is «Геометрия и физика двумерных алгебр в интерференционных структурах». That's GGC and physics of two-dimensional algebras in interference structures. And it's by Oleg Basargin.
Yeah, and right from the get-go, I have to say, the title hits you with a mouthful. But the core idea it tackles is this, how the structure of certain two-dimensional algebras, especially those described by Kokorev and Pavlov, actually shapes the way interference patterns appear in quantum systems.
Exactly. And it's not just an abstract exercise. If you think about it, traditional physics has always approached interference as just this wave effect. Like two waves overlap and you sum their heights, right? But Basargin gets into why it's more than that. He's saying, the pattern you see is determined not only by the wavelength or simple phase, but by the deeper logic of how the sources, the generators, are connected.
Right, and that's pretty fascinating, because he brings in this model called the spiral, which is, let's see if I can explain it, kind of like a geometric structure where loops, nodes, and twists form a stable, wave-like framework. The abstract mentions algebraic causality, too, which is a bit of a heavy term, but I think the gist is the geometry of these connections locks in how the interference actually forms.
And wait, hold on. Let's just focus for a second on the significance. Because, why should we care? Well, if interference isn't just random overlapping of waves, but instead is, dictated by algebraic connections, then we might need a whole new language to describe quantum systems and even things like information logic or biological rhythms.
Yeah, so if you're, say, building quantum computers or designing sensitive measurement devices, you can't just treat interference as noise or a side effect. Instead, according to this paper, it's like a fingerprint of the underlying system's logic. By the way, did you notice that Basargin suggests replacing traditional Boolean logic, true or false, on or off, with something he calls phase logic?
Oh, that bit caught my eye. It's like, instead of logic gates switching 0 or 1, now you have truth as maximum constructive interference and falsehood as destructive nulls. Decisions are made by rhythm and connection rather than hard states. I mean, it feels a little poetic, honestly.
Okay, but how does that even work? Are we picturing computers running on, loops and knots instead of transistors?
Sort of. He talks about the potential for wave logic machines, where your signal isn't a voltage pulse, but a pattern of phase-coherent state transitions. It's almost as if information travels on the structure or the rhythm the same way melodies ride the structure of a musical instrument.
There's also the idea in the paper of using these interference structures to describe things like quantum neural networks, where the connections between nodes aren't just weighted, but exist in relation to phases. That's a lot to wrap your head around. It's kind of like, have you ever tried to program a synthesizer and just ended up making weird atonal noises because the oscillators got out of sync?
Oh, don't remind me. I once spent a whole night trying to get a drone sound to stabilize and ended up with what sounded like an angry spaceship. But, in essence, Basargin is proposing we use the geometry of phase, and not just amplitude, to define the basic units in both physical and logical systems.
He also hints at real-world applications, like not just quantum stuff, but maybe even biological systems. Think about modeling brain waves or designing gyroscopes that use interference for navigation.
I guess the bigger message here is that algebra isn't just a math exercise. It's actually, baked into the very physics of how things connect and interact at a fundamental level. If we start treating interference as the visible result of hidden algebraic structures, who knows where that leads? It's like, and maybe I'm reaching here, it's like discovering that musical harmony is rooted in math, but on a much deeper physical scale.
Yeah, although, sometimes when I hear phrases like non-associative anti-symmetric algebra, I think, man, what if that's just math people's way of keeping everyone else out of their sandbox?
Maybe. But the point is, Basargin's work opens the door to thinking differently about not just quantum mechanics, but logic, computation, even biology. None of this is fixed truth. It's new language and new insight for exploring really complex systems.
Right, and even if these ideas end up only partially mapping the real world, they give us cool new tools for imagination and invention. I don't know, maybe someday we'll have phase rhythm computers playing our music for us, not just following scores.
Or angry spaceship drones. Anyway, I guess the takeaway is, sometimes it's the structure, not the stuff inside it, that drives what's really possible.
Couldn't have said it better.
The paper we're diving into today is called The Sfiral Language as a Tool for Transcending Binary Perception, A Path to Multidimensional Reality, by O.S. Basargin. Quite a title, huh?
Yeah, just a casual Thursday topic, transcending binary perception and finding a new reality. No biggie. But honestly, the minute I saw Plato's allegory of the cave in the abstract, I was like, oh, this is about getting out of some serious intellectual shadows.
Exactly. And the core question Basargin tackles is, well, why are we all thinking in these really rigid either-or ways? Like good versus bad, true versus false. It's super constraining. But it's kind of how our society and technology are hardwired.
Totally. This idea that we're stuck in a kind of black or white thinking is, both really obvious and also easy to forget in daily life. Basargin's twist is that he's proposing this thing called the Sfiral language. It's a symbolic or even visual language, apparently created by casting light and shadow with this Sfiral device, and it supposedly helps us break out of the binary cage.
Right. And what I find fascinating is how the Sfiral device generates these light shadow symbols that kind of echo forms you find in ancient scripts. We're talking about things like Cherokee script, Sumerian cuneiform, even ancient Chinese jiaguwen, and more. He argues that these symbols have this multidimensionality that goes beyond yes-no logic.
So, to break that down, he isn't just like, look, a squiggle. He's actually saying these shapes, like loops and S-curves, show up in all these ancient systems. And he suggests they represent concepts that are richer than just on or off. So you've got motion, community, harmony, all woven into these symbols.
The methodology is actually pretty hands-on. He shines a light through the Sfiral device, analyzes the shapes that come out, and then compares those with ancient scripts. And it isn't just a one-to-one mapping. He really tries to dig into what those shapes have meant across cultures. It's sort of a mashup of linguistics, philosophy, even a little tech design and biology.
Yeah, the biology bit was a surprise for me. He talks about spiral DNA, which riffs on the idea of mirror antisymmetry and fractals, sort of mapping these symbolic patterns onto how genes replicate. That part felt a little speculative, if I'm honest, but also kind of mind-blowing if you don't try to nitpick the science.
Well, and then there's the technology angle. He sketches out the idea for a convergent programming language using these spiral-inspired operators. So instead of, if X is true, do Y, you'd have functions for flow, connection, and harmony. It's like redesigning the logic of computers, or maybe AI, to be less binary, more multidimensional.
Which is pretty wild because it makes you think, Are we missing discovery or creativity in tech and biology just because our foundational logic is so binary? I mean, computers as we know them, classical ones at least, are all zeros and ones. But maybe that's just a convenience, not a law of nature.
It does kind of echo quantum computing, right? Where multiple states can coexist and logic isn't so black and white. But, Basargin isn't claiming to have solved everything. There's a real humility. He brings up that there are huge challenges, like how would you actually integrate this language into daily life? Or what kind of shifts would society need?
I liked that he leaves a lot of open questions. There's a risk with these visionary ideas that you start sounding, I don't know, like you're on another planet. But he circles back to say, look, more research is needed. We can't just spiral our way to utopia.
And I guess that's the takeaway for listeners. Academic research, especially something as philosophical as this, isn't about laying down absolute truths. It's more like giving us new tools to poke at reality and, maybe, see what we've been missing by staying so devoted to binary perception.
Yeah, and not to get too sidetracked, but it makes me think about how, growing up, we're taught to answer questions in school with one right answer. It's kind of radical to imagine a world where the answers swirl around each other or even merge.
No, you're right. It's a bit like jazz, isn't it? Improvising meaning, rather than marching down a predictable scale. But, to wrap, Basargin's spiral language kind of nudges us to imagine, and maybe strive for, a richer, more interconnected way of thinking. It's still just a proposal, but the conversation it opens is pretty invaluable.
Agreed. I mean, maybe next time we'll talk in S-shaped squiggles instead of words. Or maybe not. Either way, it's a good reminder that how we describe reality shapes what we can actually see.
Well said. And on that possibly S-shaped note, let's leave it there for now. The paper we're diving into today is «Геометрия и физика двумерных алгебр в построении фрактального ядра» by Oleg Басаргин.
Yeah, that title alone is already a mouthful, and probably scary for anybody who isn't super into math or theoretical physics. But hang on, because what Basargin's doing here is honestly pretty compelling. He's basically asking, hey, what if our computers, or computational cores, could actually have their logic determined by their geometry, not just standard linear operations?
Exactly. The core problem he's digging into is, can we move beyond typical linear Boolean logic in computers and instead use geometric structures, specifically two-dimensional algebras, to build a whole new kind of computational core? And why does that matter? Well, if this idea works, it could lead to machines that compute in ways more similar to how nature or even the brain works, less rigid, more capable of adaptation, maybe even better at context.
Right, and Basargin doesn't start this from nothing. He builds on the work by Kokorev and Pavlov, who described these two-dimensional algebras. Unlike regular algebra you get in school, these have operations that are non-associative and non-commutative, meaning the order absolutely matters, and you can get different answers if you flip things around.
Let's pause there, because I feel like most of us aren't thinking about associativity over breakfast. But it's kind of like, if you're assembling furniture, if you do step 1, then step 2, you end up with something way different than shuffling the steps around. These algebras basically bake that idea into their logic. They're not just strict and one-dimensional.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And so Basargin proposes using this structure called a spiral, which, if I'm pronouncing it anywhere close to correct, is like a double spiral, or maybe, a helical loop with this S-shaped twist connecting two coils.
He describes each coil as holding a state, like a storage part in computation. The S-shaped loop is actually the operation, the transformation happening between those states. And in the very middle, where these twist, you have this special node. Basargin links that to a triadic operation, or even what mathematicians call an associator, which is one of those fundamental triggers for changing the direction of the whole computation.
It gets a little fractal from here, right? Because the idea is, if you chain these spirals together, nesting them at different scales and orientations, you don't have repetitive or linear operations anymore. Instead, you get structures that kinda, well, evolve depending on their geometry. The parameters, like alpha, beta, k, phi, they set things like how deep the nesting goes, the phase shifts, the rhythm. It's like mixing music, but for computational logic.
Yeah, isn't that wild? I mean, instead of processing information through a single clock tick or by some universal timing, here, structure, phase, and rhythm steer the computations. It's actually kind of beautiful, and it almost sounds, I don't know, poetic?
Totally. Though I have to admit, sometimes when people push these analogies between nature and computing, like saying, let's build computers that act like fractal trees, I wonder if it's just science fiction or if there's a there. I mean, do you see any clear applications, or is it still theoretical?
Good question. Right now, it feels mostly theoretical. But Basargin does hint that such a fractal core could be a good fit for tasks where context, adaptation, and even probability come into play. So, say, neural networks or AI, where the old idea of everything being true or false just doesn't cut it anymore.
And random digression here, but you remember those old screensavers with endlessly repeating fractals? It's weird to think those patterns could one day underpin how a computer actually processes information and not just look pretty on your screen.
Oh, I loved those. Hypnotic. But coming back, what Basargin offers isn't a finished computer. It's a framework. A very abstract blueprint for computational systems where the rules aren't fixed in advance, but kind of emerge from the way you build the structure. That means, in theory, you get a system that can adapt, maybe understand rhythm and phase rather than just sequence.
So, for anyone listening, or I guess reading, the big insight here is computation doesn't have to be locked into those strict, cold rules we're used to. Research like this suggests we might one day have machines that bend, adapt, even feel a little more alive. But, it's early days. We're not running our phones on fractal cores just yet.
Yeah, and I think Basargin's work is kind of an invitation, a way to rethink what it means for something to compute, as much as a technical proposal. It's not absolute truth, just a new perspective worth wrestling with. And honestly, I think that's exciting.
Agreed. Sometimes the wildest ideas end up being the most important, even if they seem out there at first. So, here's to spirals, fractals, and thinking way, way outside the box.
Or outside the linear chip. That's a wrap, I think. The paper we're diving into today is «Геометрия и физика двумерных алгебр в устройстве Сфираль», or in English, «The Geometry and Physics of Two-Dimensional Algebras in the Sfiral Device» by Oleg Basargin.
Yeah, and it's not just a catchy title, right? It sits at that surprising intersection of abstract math and almost sci-fi level physics. I have to say, this is one of those papers that sounds theoretical, but you start reading and go, wait, this actually touches on some wild ideas about how physical reality and even time itself could be structured.
Exactly. And at its core, the paper asks this big question. Can algebra, not just as a tool for describing things, but as the actual raw ingredient, be the source of physical structure? And then, using this notional device called Sfiral or spiral, it tries to show how these pretty abstract mathematical properties get a kind of physical embodiment.
Right, it's inspired by earlier work from Kokorev and Pavlov about two-dimensional algebras, so algebras with operations involving pairs of elements instead of our more familiar numbers or vectors. What Basargin adds is this almost mechanical model, Sfiro, which makes all these properties, like non-associativity and anti-symmetry, tangible, as if you could hold abstract algebra in your hand.
And Sfiral itself is described as a kind of topologically stable object. So think, two mirrored spiral coils joined by an S-shaped loop. The wild thing is that the way you combine them, or the order you connect the coils, really matters. That's actually the physical manifestation of what mathematicians call non-associativity.
Yeah, like for real, if you try to connect the coils in a different order, the structure literally changes. So it's not just algebra on paper, but structure in space. And the S-shaped loop acts like a physical analog to the associator symbol in algebra, measuring the difference between two bracketed operations. I just find it hilarious that we're talking about something as academic sounding as associators, but now with actual loops and nodes.
And the central node, a sort of knot in the S loop, plays this conceptual role as the zero, or the point where polarity shifts. Which, when you put that next to how we use zero as a marker in math or a point of transition, it actually makes the analogy feel a bit less forced.
Totally. And then, Basargin connects this physical spheral structure with the concept of time. So, according to Kokorev and Pavlov, time isn't just this backdrop ticking away, it's the sequence or order of operations. Here, Basargin says, well, spheral doesn't just record order, it generates rhythm and pulses in time. The knots, the nodes, those represent phase jumps, almost like beats in the flow of time structure itself.
Honestly, that's such a fascinating turn, because we're so used to thinking about time as an outside parameter, right? But in this model, time sort of emerges from the logical flow of the system itself. It almost feels, closer to what happens in computer science with state machines, or maybe even music, if you think about it as rhythm and structure.
Ha! And now you've got me picturing the spheral as some kind of wild, mathematically tuned musical instrument. But anyway, another point the paper touches on is anti-symmetry, the idea that some operations aren't reversible. In algebra, that's abstract. Here, it's baked into the physical form. The mirrored coils can't be closed up on themselves without breaking the pattern, so to speak.
Right, which means anti-symmetry isn't just some mathematical curiosity, but a kind of physical constraint. Almost like the principle of action and reaction in mechanics, or the way electrical charges switch polarity. It's a neat reminder that some mathematical rules probably have deep roots in how structures maintain themselves in the real world.
And there's this speculative bit about potential applications, like devices where the logic of operations is literally hardwired into their geometry, not just lines of code on a chip. Maybe quantum computing or neuromorphic systems. It's cool to imagine a physical device that thinks algebraically just because of how it's shaped.
Yeah, though, we should admit, the paper's definitely theoretical. It's more like a guide for future thinking than blueprints for gadgets. Like all academic research, it's not some absolute truth, more like a new way to think about the link between math, physics, and possibly consciousness.
I mean, that's the thing. Sometimes what looks totally abstract ends up inspiring the next tech leap, and sometimes it just, helps us see our old problems with fresh eyes. By the way, this kind of reminds me of those Mobius band toys we had as kids. Endless surfaces, simple but weirdly profound. Though, now that I think of it, I never really understood what Mobius was all about until college.
Same here. But maybe that's the real takeaway. That new structures, even ones made out of pure math, can change how we see both the world and ourselves. Anyway, this paper gives us a lot to chew on about the deep connections between algebraic logic and the fabric of reality.
Absolutely. And if nothing else, it proves that sometimes the boundaries between ideas and things are a lot blurrier than we think. Always more to ponder, right?
Always. So, the paper we're diving into today is «Геометрия и физика двумерных алгебр. Возвращение узла». That's Geometry and Physics of Two-Dimensional Algebras, The Return of the Knot, by Oleg Basargin.
Right, and what's funny is how the title itself hints there's something more happening with this whole knot idea. Not just in math, but in how we think about time and structure itself.
Exactly. So let's start with the core problem the paper tackles, which is, what is a knot in the context of two-dimensional algebra and physics? The traditional view treats a knot as, well, basically a fixed point where things intersect or twist. But Basargin says, hold on, maybe a knot is actually more an event than an object.
Yeah, he's like, don't think of a knot as a dot on a diagram where lines cross. Think of it as a kind of turning point. So, he builds off work by Kokorev and Pavlov, who did these earlier studies on two-dimensional algebra, where the order of operations really matters. Unlike in standard algebra, moving things around gives you different results.
Which is already kind of wild, because we usually count on associativity to keep our math neat. But here, right at the knot, associativity breaks down. It's as if reality itself takes a sharp turn. The knot marks the moment when everything flips or changes direction.
What's really cool is he links this to the so-called spiral model of time. Instead of time being a straight line, imagine it like a spiral, with knots marking the spots where phases shift, directions reverse, or, I don't know, the universe gets a little jolt.
Or where your day takes an unexpected turn. Same principle, just scaled up. But, seriously, Basargin spells out some key functions for these algebraic knots. They represent phase switches, direction changes, even jumps to new levels of nesting. Like, think Russian dolls, but made out of logic.
Yeah, and he compares a knot to, say, a quantum jump, or even a sudden switch in a computer program, a recursion call, or a shift in the logical context. So, it's not just mathematics, it's a kind of syntax for how change happens, even in our thought processes.
That's my favorite part. He argues that if time itself is structured with these knots, then thought, like actual cognition, might be as well. When you change your mind or switch focus or suddenly see a connection, that could be like passing through a knot.
And in language, too. For linguistics geeks, Basargin says a knot could mark where grammar flips and meaning shifts. Honestly, it reminds me of that feeling mid-sentence when you realize you actually started saying the wrong thing, so you pivot and somehow land on a new idea.
Or, like when you start cleaning your desk but end up rearranging your bookshelves. I do that all the time, even though that's not a knot exactly, but the sudden switch is kind of similar.
I mean, in Basargin's logic, maybe that is a knot, an operational jump. What I find interesting is, by seeing the knot as an act rather than a static place, the paper suggests models of time and meaning that are non-linear, pulsing, more like rhythms or networks, less like straight lines.
Totally, and I think that matters outside abstract math. It's a way to formalize those turning points in anything, science, art, daily life. Like, rather than treating change as an interruption, he's inviting us to see it as the structural core, the moment something new can happen.
Right, and the return of the knot is his way of saying, let's bring this dynamic idea back into how we model not just equations, but experience. Instead of logic being a series of steps, it becomes a living, twisting dance, shaped by each knot we pass through.
Of course, like any academic model, it's not the truth, full stop. It's a lens. But it gives us a tangible way to look at how transformation and discontinuity are built into the very fabric of things, whether math equations, computer programs, or the way we switch thoughts mid-conversation.
Which, I guess is another kind of knot? Anyway, definitely a thought-provoking paper. Makes you realize knots aren't just in ropes or shoelaces or your headphones. They're everywhere you look if you know how to see them.
And sometimes, I guess, you just have to untangle them. And sometimes, just let the knot be the turning point. That feels like a good place to end the conversation for today.
Agreed. Let's spiral onward.
The paper we're diving into today is «Сфираль и квантовые вычисления. Концептуальная гипотеза», which translates to something like «The Spiral and Quantum Computing, a Conceptual Hypothesis». And it's written by Oleg Basargin.
Yeah, I gotta say, as soon as I saw that title, I was like, hold on, a spiral? In quantum computing? Not something you hear every day.
Exactly. So, at its core, what Basargin's tackling here is a pretty big issue in quantum computing right now. How do you build qubits? Not just any qubits, but ones that are actually stable and robust, especially against, tiny errors and disturbances from the outside world.
Right, and just to set the stage, the dominant players, or like the cool kids on the block these days, are so-called topological quantum computers, which use these weird things called Majorana zero modes. They're pretty famous because, in theory, they're immune to a lot of the environmental noise that plagues regular quantum bits.
Which sounds super impressive. Except even these systems, as Basargin points out, have practical engineering headaches. You still need really complex tricks to control and measure these Majoranas.
That's where this spiral, he calls it a Sfiral, I guess, comes in. Basargin hypothesizes an entirely new architecture for quantum computing, grounded in this geometric or maybe even topological spiral concept.
Yeah, and one of the fundamental ideas here is something he calls mirror anti-symmetry. It's a principle that, in the context of a spiral, lets you switch between quantum states without losing information. Like, picture a spiral that you can flip or mirror, and the information stays whole.
And the crucial thing is, if that pans out, it could offer a new way to topologically protect qubits. Instead of just using Majorana physics, you'd have this geometric, spiral-based robustness. So, like a qubit that shrugs off disturbances because of its mathematical properties.
But it's not just about the spiral shape, right? There's another layer he brings in. He talks about what he calls S-shaped or S-curve transitions. The idea is, these S-shaped transitions describe smooth transformations between quantum states.
Yeah, so instead of flipping a bit abruptly, you, glide from one state to another. That smoothness can help with quantum interference and managing something called parity, which is a big deal when you're talking about Majorana zero modes.
And there's this leap that Basargin makes. He's suggesting these smooth, S-shaped transformations could let you develop entirely new quantum logic gates. It's like reimagining the very building blocks of quantum programming.
And the paper doesn't stop there. He goes one layer deeper and throws in fractals. So the information isn't just on a spiral, it's distributed in some sort of fractal, multidimensional way. Picture nested spirals within spirals, almost like those old Matryoshka dolls.
Or, like if you ever spiraled a notebook wire and then noticed the little loops inside the loops. Okay, maybe that's not the best analogy, but...
No, that works. It's this idea that quantum information isn't stuck on a line or a simple surface. It can be layered, at multiple scales, which opens up new possibilities for superposition and entanglement.
And here's something I found interesting. He looks at how this approach could reshape quantum programming itself. He suggests using what he calls spiral coordinates, which, instead of describing quantum states in the usual kind of boring spherical terms, adds this fractal, layered dimension.
It reminds me a bit of when programmers switched from machine code to using higher-level languages. Suddenly, there's this entirely new way of visualizing and manipulating information.
Totally. I actually wonder what kind of algorithms would come out of something like this. Will it be, more efficient? Or maybe even able to do new things we can't really imagine yet?
That's the thing, yeah. Basargin's honest about where he's at. This is still all in the what-if phase. He even says the next steps are, developing the math, doing simulations, and figuring out how to physically make this work in a laboratory quantum processor.
And, it's important to remember, this is a conceptual hypothesis. It's not, facts written on stone tablets. It's a creative leap, a suggestion, a way to maybe look at quantum systems from a fresh, geometric perspective.
Yeah, I always think papers like this, even if they end up way off the mark, are super valuable because they make you question what you think is possible.
For anyone listening, I guess the takeaway is that, in research, especially at the edge like quantum computing, the final word is never written. Approaches like Basargin's invite us to consider maybe there's a whole new geometry out there, waiting to, revolutionize how we process information.
That, and maybe spirals, really do show up everywhere. Fibonacci, galaxies, and now quantum bits?
Ha, true. Next, we'll find them in our morning coffee. Anyway, I, for one, am curious to see where Basargin's ideas go from here.
Same here. It's always exciting when someone throws a new shape into the mix.